The first time a tenant pays late, most landlords think they're dealing with a payment issue. So they send a reminder, maybe a late notice, even a warning. Then they move on like the situation's handled. But a few months later, that same property starts feeling different. Communication gets slower. Small issues stop getting reported. Standards inside the unit start slipping. Conversations get shorter, colder, and more defensive. And eventually both sides end up frustrated with each other, each thinking the other side is the problem. But the real issue usually started way earlier than that. It started the moment the structure around the behavior stopped feeling consistent. That's the part this industry still doesn't fully understand. People don't only respond to rules, they respond to predictability. They study environments. They watch what gets enforced, what gets ignored, what changes depending on timing, mood, pressure, or convenience. And once people realize the structure moved around, behavior starts moving around with it. That's human nature. It's the same reason corporations built HR systems. It's not that companies enjoy paperwork and meetings. Because the second behavior becomes inconsistent inside the organization, stability starts collapsing fast. Imagine showing up to work and every manager enforces standards differently depending on how they felt that day. Nobody would know where the boundaries actually were. That environment would become chaotic almost immediately. So companies created systems, documented standards, predictable escalation, consistent enforcement, and defined response because they're operational. And that's what's been missing from landlording for a very long time. Most landlords are still trying to control $1 million environments through reaction instead of governance. That's why the same cycle keeps repeating. Late rent, communication breakdown, property neglect, boundary testing, selective compliance, to name a few. Not because tenants are uniquely terrible, because behavior always adjusts itself to the condition of the structure surrounding it. That's the prime directive behind tenant goldmine. Behavior degrades when structure disappears, not emotionally, operationally. The second the standard becomes inconsistent, people begin interpreting instead of following. And interpretation is where degradation starts. Because once people stop trusting the structure to stay consistent, they stop treating the standards as real. That's when things begin stacking. That late payment becomes not a huge deal. The maintenance issue can wait a little longer. The trash sitting outside the unit becomes temporary. The communication delay becomes normal. And eventually the entire environment starts drifting without anybody noticing how far it moved from the original standard. That's how degradation actually works. Quietly, gradually, and structurally. And this is where most landlords completely misread what they're looking at. They see the visible behavior and think that's the root issue. It usually isn't. The behavior is often the symptom. The real problem is the condition of the structure surrounding the behavior. That's why tenant goldmine doesn't evaluate behavior independently from structure. You evaluate clarity of standards, consistency of enforcement, predictability of consequence, and continuity of response over time. Because behavior is diagnostic. It tells you the health of the operating environment. If communication keeps breaking down, something about the structure is unstable. If standards keep slipping, something about enforcement is inconsistent. If tenants selectively comply depending on the situation, the boundaries are no longer predictable. Those patterns are not random. They're operational signals. And the dangerous part is how many landlords accidentally reinforce degradation themselves. They delay difficult conversations. They make emotional exceptions. They enforce standards differently depending on the tenant. They loosen boundaries when they're busy. They ignore early stage deviation because it feels small, but degradation always compounds. That's what landlords miss. Behavior never stays still. It either stabilizes through structure or degrades through inconsistency. There's no neutral position. That's why every stable environment on the earth depends on reinforcement. The military drills repetition constantly because repeated structure creates predictable behavior under pressure. Hospitals rely on procedure because inconsistency in critical environments create chaos fast. Airlines use checklists because memory and emotion are unreliable. Even high-level corporations document everything because once standards become selective, authority collapses. Meanwhile, landlords are still trying to govern properties through verbal expectations and reactive correction. That's insane when you really think about it, especially when these are environments tied directly to money, liability, safety, asset preservation, human behavior, and long-term operational stability. And this is exactly why the prime directive matters so much. Structure must be established before behavior is evaluated. Structure must be maintained before behavior is corrected. Structure must be enforced before stability can be expected. That changes everything. Because now you stop reacting emotionally to isolated moments and start governing patterns instead. Huge difference. At this point, you should be asking different questions. Not why are tenants like this, but where did the structure stop feeling real? Not how do I fix this one issue, but what pattern allowed this issue to normalize? That's what governance is. That's operational thinking. And once landlords finally understand that shift, the whole property starts operating differently. Communication tightens. Standards stabilize. Deviation becomes visible early. Correction becomes cleaner. And behavior becomes more predictable because people can finally trust the structure around them to stay consistent. That's what real authority actually is. Not aggression, emotion, or intimidation. Predictability. Because predictable structure creates stable environments. And stable environments protect profit better than reactive ever will. So it's quite simple. You train, protect, prosper. We teach before we tax. We partner before we punish. We build people, therefore we protect property. That's operational law. So if your property feels like it's slowly drifting out of control, stop starting only at the behavior. Look at the structure surrounding it, because behavior degradation almost always starts there.